Radical Secular, a video series dedicated to the separation of church and state and the pursuit of justice.
Hello and welcome back to The Radical Secular. I'm Christoph Defoe.
I'm Sean Prophet.
Today we're going to delve into the highly controversial topic of biology, race, and IQ. But first, we'll discuss the Trump GOP sore loser club and most recent developments in the Trump 19 disaster saga clusterfuck. And we'll update you on what's going on in Nigeria. But before we get into any of that, I want to remind you to make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit that big red subscribe button, smash the shit out of it. And be sure to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast host and write us a review over at Apple. That's huge because positive podcast reviews at Apple help us grow in their recommendations list faster than almost anything else. Also, be sure to tell your friends and family about the show. Word of mouth definitely matters.
Email us at theradicalsecular@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram @radical_secular. Follow us on Twitter @radicalsecular. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, podcasts at Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher.
Okay, now for the fun stuff. Let's get into the t-shirts. Sean, what about you? What do you got?
I have the squad today.
Awesome. And that's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Anaya Presley of Massachusetts, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Very, very cool, dude. Very, very cool.
We love them.
They are the best. And look, they're challenging orthodoxy. And you always just have to have that energy, right? Because as we talk about on the show all the time, when power gets entrenched, when people get sort of in their position, they don't want to give it up, and new ideas go out the window, and old orthodoxies become sort of really entrenched. And so it's really important to have these kind of voices. First of all, just that fresh, young, sort of passionate voice, but also a voice that's like super, like really into justice, really into Green New Deal, all this sort of stuff. Super important.
Yeah, and they all won re-election. So we thought initially, some people probably thought they were a flash in the pan, but they're here to stay. And I think it's important that they push the Democratic Party to the left. I think there's a little bit of a danger in some cases where people get a little carried away with it, and they try to because these women are so passionate, and they are so, they're exactly what we need. I would vote for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for president. They know exactly what we need for the nation's future. But unfortunately, we have a system that makes it impossible for us to get a lot of what they're proposing in any kind of time frame that, it's just... There's so much that has to happen before we could go full bore towards that type of an agenda.
That's exactly right. And you and I were talking a little bit about this earlier today, and it's so important, right? I think Nancy Pelosi, I think she's just a great example of this, right? Because in 2018, when the Democrats took back Congress, there was this huge push to be like, no Nancy Pelosi, right? None of that old guard. These people came in on a wave of leftism, and we need to sort of harness that, right? And that does sound like a good argument, except for it's not, right? Because it and it's not because look, we would be in a world of shit right now if Nancy Pelosi hadn't been running the Democratic Party for the last 4 years, right? She has the know-how, the expertise, the relationships, the clout to actually be able to navigate a party through being in the minority with no cards to play. Having that fresh energy, like you're saying, is great, but it's not enough to wash over the walls of conservative intractability that we have to get past to get any of this done.
It's kind of like if you go to a restaurant or you go to watch a play or you go to Disneyland or anywhere where there's a huge operation going on behind the scenes. Most people are not aware of what goes into making law. And if they were, they would probably be horrified because it takes veteran insiders to get things done. And there's a lot of compromise and horse trading that goes on. And that's based on relationships.
Exactly.
You could get me going on a whole tear about term limits and how we don't want a bunch of fresh fresh people in because you have to build coalitions, and it takes multiple terms to do that. And so anyway.
That is so important. And, when the presidents come and go, but like high-ranking House officials and high-ranking Senate officials, they are always there, right? They are there developing relationships, maintaining relationships, and more. And this is something that liberals don't understand. And I think that a lot of folks don't understand. They're accumulating power, right? People do not understand how power works. And this, like, politics is a war, right? It is purely about who has leverage and who doesn't have leverage, right? And you get leverage through making coalitions. You make coalitions by having relationships. You have relationships by having been there for more than 2 years,
Yeah, and even the way things used to work, bipartisanship, sometimes those coalitions extend across the aisle.
Exactly.
Not so much anymore, but how are you going to do that if you just have a bunch of new people who don't know how to work with others?
Exactly. And who are, fiery, which is great. I just before we move on to my t-shirt, I just want to sort of tack on the Bernie Sanders element here, right? Because their whole argument is that, no, we need to go more to the left, right? If we go more to the left, we'll engage young people and and there'll be some sort of wave that'll wash over the intransigent, the entrenched interest. And that is just not going to happen. And Bernie Sanders' campaign was the quintessential example of that. Like, they had everything they wanted. They had the momentum. They had the money. They had everything. And guess what? America didn't go for it. And so we have to be realistic. Would I love a Green New Deal? Would I love it? Of course I would. But we'll have to fight for every inch. We have to fight for every inch to get anywhere close to that.
You got to get the Senate. And if you don't have the Senate and the White House, you don't have a Green New Deal. So
exactly.
And that's the bottom line. A lot of these guys, they'll say things like, well, the earth doesn't have time to wait for this institutional politics. They say this crap like, well, so what do you want to do? Snap your fingers? I mean, wave your magic wand and make it happen? Right. It's insane.
And that's the problem with the whole Bernie approach, which, again, I'm very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders, and I like him.
So am I. I voted for him in the primary.
Exactly. And I would have happily voted in for president, would have voted in for president. But the fact is that is not the face of America. And there's just not enough of us. And we can get there hopefully one day. But right now, today, we are not there, and we have to recognize where we actually are and fight on those terms, which is something Democrats are famously not willing to do, to get into the fucking trenches, right?
Yeah. Yep. I mean, I know that Nancy Pelosi is nearing the end, and I hope she has somebody selected who can bring those institutional relationships forward. And maybe it is one of the squad. If they can do it in the next 2 years, if they can apprentice, but they have to first of all recognize her for who and what she is and what she offers. And she offers the best opportunity to get these progressive things done.
Exactly. And to segue into my t-shirt, even though it's a long t-shirt segment, but hey, it's a good discussion. Yeah. And I think what is important here in terms of my t-shirt that sort of connects our two t-shirts in our discussions about them is thinking, right? And I'll show you my t-shirt now.
It is the godfish, except it says science in the center of it. And we've seen them on the back of all sorts of people's cars with Jesus and the IHOXI or whatever that is, the fish, the fish in Greek or whatever it is. But this one says science, and I think it's obvious why that's great.
That's obvious. That's great. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I'm wearing it. This is a retread. I've worn it in a past episode, but I thought it was really salient today. And to connect it to what you're talking about, science really is at bottom about good thinking, right? It's about thinking about things rationally and building building arguments, building a worldview, right? Building a society around being able to think clearly and reason well, right? And that is something that is, in a lot of ways, definitely woefully lacking on the right, but also on the left. On the left, right? This idea of no, you have to set aside your your sort of big ideas sometimes and just get practical, very, very practical. And anyway, and today, of course, we're going to be talking about race, and we're going to be talking about science, and we're going to talk about how science has been historically misused to justify discrimination. So science seemed to me to be the shirt to wear today. Yeah, go ahead, comment on that.
Definitely. I mean, science is such a powerful tool that when it's abused, it's extremely damaging. And that's what we have to understand. What people who are into various aspects of pseudoscience or even religion will try to bastardize science to support their unscientific viewpoints. And the thing that we're talking about today, which is that the sort of eugenicist race science garbage is very much in that category.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. And what we're going to do now is the news. And there is so much news, Sean. I mean, boy, the sore loser club, man. There was the MAGA march, which was the sore loser march, right? We got a president who's been in his bunker. You remember they spent the entire campaign making fun of Biden for staying in his bunker, which he didn't, but staying in his bunker during the entire campaign. And this man has not even been able to show his face out in public since he lost. And then, speaking of faces, some makeup dripped down the face of a famous Ghoul who has subsequently gotten COVID-19 and is just out there making a goddamn fool of himself and just embarrassing lawyers. Look, everyone hates us anyway. Giuliani does not make it any fucking better.
Giuliani is, I don't think, I'm trying to rack my brain to think of an American who has fallen so far from being America's mayor in New York, really did a good job pulling that city together and handling the aftermath of 9/11. Nobody could deny that. And now he has turned into not just a ghoul or a creep, but a fascist.
Yeah, a fascist ghoul creep clown.
Just absurd. I mean, the image. I know that I know we can't make fun of people's appearances, but his, that was pretty epic not in a good way. Not in a good way.
And the legal strategy has fallen on its face, right? So, and they have been, I think last time we talked, they were 0 for 12. Now I think there's something like 0 for 29. I think they are in court.
Yeah.
And they are running out of those kinds of arguments. And so what they're doing instead now is just straight up mob type shit, right? Like President Trump is calling people and forcing them.
It's a series of fallback positions that they have engaged in. And it started out really, and you could see this all coming on the night of the election when he got up there at 2:00 in the morning and whined about the fact that, we were ahead and now we're not ahead anymore. And it's just, he committed himself early on to fighting the result of the election. And he had done this previously in the campaign. And even in 2016, he basically said that he would only respect the result if he won. So from the beginning of Trump's entry into politics, he has not abided by any democratic norms. And this is just this is a further escalation of what happens when someone who is not committed to our form of government gets in power. And the most chilling thing was what Chris Krebs said. And Chris Krebs is the head of the U.S. cybersecurity, and he was the one who was just fired for having said that we had a safe and fair and secure election. And that did not sit well with Trump. So Trump fired him. And Krebs was awesome because he said after he got fired, we did it right and I'd do it again. So it was an awesome, that guy's a patriot. But what his reaction to the Giuliani news conference was that it was the most dangerous hour and 45 minutes of American television in our history. And I don't disagree with that, because you got to remember that we look at this as something absurd, but you've got all the people who voted for Trump. Now, not all of them are falling for this garbage. A lot of them know it's garbage, but a substantial portion of those people are taking this very seriously, and it is undermining their confidence in the U.S. electoral process. that was, by all observations, the most solid expression of that process that we've ever had.
That's absolutely right, man. And you know, we were talking earlier, and you said, and it's true, that there is a non-zero chance that that Joe Biden doesn't get sworn in on Inauguration Day, right? There's a non-zero chance, and that's true, and that is the fact that you and I are having this discussion, Sean. Can you imagine if you and I are going to have a conversation in which we're going to be discussing whether or not there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power? Like, that's the conversation. Like, in the 90s, I always go back to the 90s because I always think back to this sort of, like, I always said that pastel time of post Soviet Union, United Nation, America bliss. Everything did seem okay for me growing up. I was a kid, but still, everything, like that big world out there, that never really touched me in the suburbs. Now we are literally having discussions about whether or not democracy is going to continue.
Well, this is it. And everybody can come down on one side or the other and say, oh, it's going to be fine, he's going to get in. Or other people can say, no, it's going to succeed. But whatever the outcome ultimately is, the fact that it's uncertain in the United States of America is utterly insane. Like, our last episode was America Goes Cuckoo, and it was a little bit of a joke because at that time it was the election had just been called, and so it was like, okay, it's over. Well, it's not over, and their procedural manipulations, they've lost in court. Now they're going to the legislatures. It seems like the legislatures are not being persuaded, but who knows? We don't know what these guys are going to do. Yeah. And we've taken something, true. It's supposed to be procedural. It's supposed to be just a pro forma rubber stamp. They take the votes, they count the votes, and they select the electors. The electors go and they vote, and nobody changes their mind. And this is what has worked every 4 years in our country since, I think it was 1876 that the last contested election happened?
I'm not sure, actually, but that's a long time ago.
It was something like that. It was the late 1800s, and
Gotcha.
It was the election of Rutherford B. Hayes.
Okay.
And Rutherford B. Hayes was he was the winner, but the other guy wouldn't concede. I forget the name of the guy's name. He wouldn't concede, and they came to some sort of accommodation that ended up with the stopping of Reconstruction. And that's huge, because what it meant is that all of the sacrifice, everything Abraham Lincoln did, everything that all the 600,000 people who died in the Civil War, all that sacrifice was now curtailed. And it didn't have the impact that it should have had we continued with Reconstruction and we are currently this is the aftermath of that.
That is, I couldn't agree more with that, because, one thing that's so true about Americans is a lack of ability to connect history to the present. And that's deliberate, right? Because America has never had to reckon with its racist past in the way that, say, Germany has, right? And Japan has, right? These countries that were decimated during 2 world wars have had to sort of start to come to terms with some of their awful. And look, there are still many things. For example, the Japanese still don't recognize a massacre of a gigantic massacre of Chinese people, right? And so I don't know the details of that. So anyone who is Chinese or Japanese listening to this of that descent, I don't want to butcher that. No pun intended, but. You see my point is that, like, that's fucked up, right?
That was.
but everyone sees my point, right? The point is that, like, right, some things are not, or the Armenian genocide, right? There's another great example of things that are just like people just don't take ownership of those, but nothing like the United States.
There's a war going on right now involving
literally right now, as we speak,
yeah.
Right? And it's like a haunting haunting repeat of the Armenian, of that era, right? So my point is that Americans were unable to sort of connect because we have a culture of not. We literally still have the rebels have statues in our cities. Like, this is a country that has not come to terms with what that was, right? And so as a result, as like you say, because we haven't sort of actually really even closed the wound fully, right? No. We continue to live with the consequences of the failure to nip this in the bud in the late 1800s.
Yeah, and what we're going to be talking about today are some of the ideas that had been really discredited, and around the time of the Civil Rights Act and things like that, it seemed like all of that was receding. And now with what's going on with Trump, suddenly it's all coming back out of the woodwork.
All coming back, man.
And the academics who were pushing that stuff, suddenly they're popular again.
Exactly. They're back. And like, right. It's like that. Yeah. It's scary. It's terrifying. Right. And going back to the Crybaby March. Right. And by the way, I want to distinguish that from the Pussy Hat March. Right. Because the Pussy Hat March. Right. Because people try to make these sort of specious sort of connections. And like, look, the Pussy, come on, man. First of all, the Pussy Hat March was not saying that Trump hadn't won, right? It was in fact a recognition that Trump had won, and that was awful, and it was a demonstration. What we're seeing in this sort of loser march was, oh no, Trump hasn't lost, right? That's two very, very different things.
No, it is, and also the Pussy Hat March really was about 1 million people, and this is supposed to be
a big thing too. Yeah,
million mega march. It's like there was like 10,000 people there, maybe 20 at the outside.
Exactly,
at the outside.
Exactly. Come on, what a false equivalence. I mean, it's maddening, absolutely maddening. So look, I mean, Trump is trying to, just to close the loop on that, right? Trump is trying to pressure legislatures, right, to basically pick electors that are going to be willing to be faithless, right? Like that is sort of, and in the meantime, trying to slow down certification in counties and states so that he can make that happen. And the good news is that it, like you said, Sean, it is a ministerial duty to literally just certify the election. And if people won't do it, a court will do it, right? But the bigger question becomes, like you say, the sort of pressuring legislatures to pick electors, and that is very unlikely, frankly. But it could happen. It was something and like you say, and this is the most important thing that you said, and I want to just piggyback on it. The bigger story here is the erosion of democratic principles, where there is 50% of Republicans, and I read this statistic just recently on Friday, maybe, 50% or so of Republicans believe that Biden won in some sort of disingenuous way, right? That he didn't win fair and square. So that is 50% of that electorate, right? That is a lot. Millions and millions and millions of Americans just don't believe in our system of government.
That's 35 million people. I mean,
that's
right
insane.
There. Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. But you got to remember, okay, I mean, it bothers the hell out of me, okay, because these people are so disingenuous and dishonest with themselves.
Yep.
But remember how many people believe that 9/11 was an inside job.
So true.
Remember how many people believe that the sun goes around the earth. I mean, it's like a quarter of the population still believes that the sun goes around the earth. You got the flat earthers, you got anti-vax people. So we have a huge QAnon. We have a huge problem in this country of people who just refuse to accept reality. And that's something that our enemies are taking advantage of.
And you know what? That's a great point. And even more so, and I'll go a little even deeper to our about in terms of our radical secular perspective, right? People also believe that are just superstitious, right? People do the same thing over and over again, and it's a natural human instinct, right? Or people don't want to have a black cat cross their path or walk under a ladder. So what I'm saying is that kind of thinking is not just at the level of QAnon people, they're batshit crazy. Of course they are. And that's 50%. But a much larger percent of the population is willing to just accept things without any real evidence, right? And that gets back to my poor thinking ability, right? That is pervasive among Americans, pervasive.
if you don't have a sound basis for what you believe, then you can basically be convinced into believing anything. Because you have, if I think that a lot of the reason why our nation held together so much better in the past is because there were informational gatekeepers. And so there wasn't all this crazy shit flying around everywhere. So I don't think people were smarter back then. I think it was just that everybody was reading the same newspaper. Everybody was watching the same TV channels. And so this shit just didn't get off the ground. It was Xerox chain letters. It was, people, I don't know, before the internet, I don't know what they did. I think they just copied chain letters and sent this stuff around, or obscure publications that were like stapled together and put in the mail. But actual books and magazines didn't have this shit.
That's right. So, yeah. And that's so important. And there was cable TV and there was the radio. Right. Like, so that's where you got those terrible messages. But now you don't, like you say, even they, like Rush Limbaugh is a gatekeeper. I'm laughing because Drew, our friend Drew on Facebook, and he put that I don't even know if I feel comfortable saying it. I mean, because it's so funny. It's so fucked up, but maybe I'm just going to say it. So he's like, I think the joke is, does Rush Limbaugh now hate his lungs because they've turned black?
Oh my God. He deserves that. He is such a white supremacist motherfucker.
He's an evil man. He's an evil man. And so that's the only reason why I can feel comfortable to laughing at that joke or even saying it, like, because it's so fucked up. But Drew, Drew, and he always does that. He pulls no fucking punches like that online. Like always. He does.
I love Drew. Big shout out to Drew, man.
Yeah, absolutely. we're going to tag Drew, I think, in the show notes. So
we are
when we post it on Facebook, so that he knows he got that was. I could always go for him if I really want the sharpest of the sharpest wit.
That's right. I just want to say one more quick thing about this process. And that is, this process was designed at a time when everything was carried by Pony Express. There is just like there's no reason to have an electoral college at this point, there's also no reason to have this crazy certification process. There's no reason for electors to have to vote separately. It's like, count the votes. That's the president. Done. This is, so this is Pony Express shit.
That's such a great point. And this also speaks to a larger issue, I think, the idea of the Constitution as a living document, right? And really the question of whether or not it just deserves a rewrite, which I know something you've talked about before. And it's obviously it's a radical concept, obviously, because we put the Constitution on a pedestal. Especially as an attorney, right? My entire law school career, like you spend the first year of law school at least, like really just in the Constitution, right? And specifically as opposed to other laws. When you get to your second and third year, you start looking at sort of other courses that are more specific to various areas of the law. So you take corporations, or you take a labor employment class, or you take a property class. But in the first instance, you are really just delving into the Constitution, and we swear an oath to it, essentially, right? And the military, right? Recently, even this week, I think one of the generals, a brave general, a patriot, came out and said, and maybe it was this week or last week, but came out and basically said, no, we don't serve the president, any particular president. We serve the Constitution ultimately. So my point is that it's on hallowed ground. So even talking about seriously revising it is, let alone, even just talking about interpreting it liberally, is bad enough, let alone talking about a serious rewrite. But I think it needs one.
Well, there's two things that can be true at the same time. Okay. One is that I am super glad that we are protected by the Constitution.
Definitely.
I am super glad that the military is in their culture, deeply in their culture, bound to the Constitution. I am super glad that most lawyers and judges feel like they're deeply bound to the Constitution. What has happened to us, though, is that we have these hacks. Ever since the Federalist Society got going and started pushing this originalism and started pushing their property over people doctrines and their whole libertarian thing and their religious, which they deny, by the way. They don't admit to being theocrats, but they are.
Oh, for sure.
And, so you get that going, and suddenly the system of constitutional checks and balances that really existed up until recently is no longer guaranteed. And the kind of backroom deal making that these guys are engaging in, and the twisted logic of the originalism, which you talk about all the time as being the most activist of judicial activism. These guys came in on the with their main justification, their main reason for being, to combat judicial activism. And what they did is they just flipped it around.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So that is all true. Okay, the Constitution, we can have respect for it while also understanding that it is holding us back as a nation more than anything else.
Yep. Those two things can be true at the same time. And that's exactly right. The Electoral College can be a terrible idea, and also the 14th Amendment can be an excellent idea, right? Those two things can be right. The free exercise clause, or more than anything else, it's corollary, right? Like those concepts can be critical and important, and also there's some really fucking bad ideas out there, and the idea that we can't, as a nation, that our system is in some ways so broken, and because, ironically, right, because the system is so antiquated, right, and it doesn't function well in today's environment, and because it doesn't function in today's environment, we can't use the tools that are in it to change it. Well,
too much of the Constitution is dependent on the integrity of the people in the government, and
that's a great point.
As I say all the time when we're talking about utilitarianism, you have to design a system that operates even if you have sociopaths in charge, right?
Right.
And you do that by putting people's interests in the government at odds with each other, so that this guy's watching this guy's watching another guy, and everybody's watching everybody else, and it's in everybody's interest to keep everybody else honest. You set that up in terms of incentives, and you put teeth in it. You don't let... like if something happened, like Mitch McConnell denying Merrick Garland a hearing, or Trump going around and trying to strong arm the Republican legislators in states to get if any of that kind of stuff happened, that gross cheating in the government, there would be consequences, automatic consequences.
Automatic, right? Not discretionary.
No.
Like you do this and that happens. Boom.
Yeah. And so we are missing all of that. We are trying to operate a system that relies on good faith with a bunch of bad faith actors in charge.
Right. That's so true. That's a really great, that might be one of the quotes we pull from this episode, I think, because that's so right. We are trying to run a system that needs good faith actors, statesmen, right? And we're doing that with people who are just simply out for profit, out for power, and out for theocracy, and bad, like you say, bad faith actors, a bottomless pit of bad faith.
I think we should put the bottomless pit of bad faith together with what I said and make one quote out of it.
There you go. That's what we're going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, look to your Facebook feeds and Instagram feeds next week, or this coming week. You'll see it.
You will.
So let's talk briefly, just to talk about, before we move on to our main topic, let's just talk about the COVID-19 problem, right? Because it's so crazy. We can sit here. We are in the midst of constitutional crisis simultaneously with the worst pandemic in 100 years. Like, wow, right? I mean, wow. And I what I really hate the memes, or the things like, oh, could 2020 be any worse? Oh, it's so funny. I'm just over it, like that, those kind of memes and stuff like that. But
trust
really
me,
though, it could be way fucking worse, but still, it's been really fucking bad for sure. So no, COVID-19 is as bad as it gets. I live in New Jersey, in Jersey City. We had our spike here early in March, and I recently got a new phone, and I was downloaded, and they asked me automatically to download the New Jersey contact tracing app or whatever, and of course I did. This from the state, and so you can just see like the trends in your area or whatever, and it'll sort of let you know.
And it's got to be doing this.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, wow, it is alarming, man. Like, it is bad. It is so bad. And we are not at the point where the hospitals are collapsing yet. But I mean, isn't that isn't that far on? Maybe we need to have Joe on again to discuss where things are.
Here's what it really is. I mean, this is what we talked about on both the shows where we discussed COVID before with Joseph. People don't understand the exponential function. That means that something can go from 1 to 3 to 10 to 30 to 100, right? From one day to the next. It's not just like linear growth.
Linear, right.
Okay, so we have that going on, and then we have a delayed reaction from whatever it is that you do. So, for example, they had Sturgis, and somewhere between a month and a half later, you started to see the spike of cases and deaths, because it's not just like somebody can get COVID and be sick in a couple of weeks and then die in a couple of weeks after that, but what happens is they transmit and then they transmit and then they transmit. So you get this building wave that occurs. And we're experiencing that now from things like Sturgis and the Trump rallies and all of these super spreader events that have occurred, states that have overturned the bans on gathering in church. I mean, it comes right down to it. I could go on for the entire hour about this, but this idea that it's something to do with liberty, that you should be able to get together, it's insanity.
It's madness.
And that's because they don't understand the exponential function. They don't understand you put 150 people in a church, you have one person in there who's infected. Now you infect 150. Each of those 150 go out and infects, 5 or 10 others. And pretty soon you got thousands of people infected from this one church service. And it's like, this is not a question of freedom, folks. This is murder.
And it really, really is. And, it's so interesting because we keep coming back so far in the show to this theme of bad thinking. It's bad thinking. It's an inability to reason. And also not just an inability to reason, but an unwillingness to even take reason seriously, right? As a source of knowledge, right? Yeah. This is a worldview that thinks of knowledge derives from authority, right? Yeah. And so and that's what makes these governors who refuse to do mask mandates, this is what makes them so, like you said, killers, murderers.
They're killers.
Right? They're literally murdering people, right? Like, because what they're doing is and Trump did the same thing. When you're not from the top, the leadership from the top matters. And especially if you have a bunch of people who can't reason on their own, Yeah. And so here we are with this wave of COVID-19 overwhelming, especially in the rural areas, right? And these are places that, first of all, have less money, have less resources, have less health care, right? They don't have a good the closest major hospital that can really take care of you might be 100-mile drive. Right. Yeah. This is what we're talking about. And it's just, again, like you say, it's fucking murder. And I don't feel badly for Don Jr. for getting sick. No. I don't feel badly, not for one fucking moment, He is a fucking criminal, man. He's a criminal.
Well, what these guys have done is, obviously, there's all the issues we've talked about before in terms of COVID, of guys not wanting to wear masks because of issues with their masculinity and vulnerability. And, we've talked about all the evolutionary origins of that. But our better angels say, do it for your neighbor.
Exactly.
And what's happened is that the Trumpists and the Trumpist governors like Kristi Noem and fucking Ron DeSantis in Florida. And those are some of the worst offenders. I really have to also single out the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin that overturned the ban on gatherings there. And there's been any number of those type of situations where Texas, there's another one where they haven't done well. And what it comes down to is all someone needs is plausible deniability to flip over from that better angel's place of taking care of your neighbor and of doing this as a patriotic duty to the place where it's like, oh, I'm not fucking wearing a mask. All they need is just, somebody at the top to give them an excuse, somebody on Fox News to suggest that this is a hoax. And that's it. And you've now just taken a third of the population and put them over into non-compliance with public health measures. And you've created murder, mass murder.
Mass murder. And, and from the top, like you say, it comes from the top. And Donald Trump does this because he's a sociopath. And so he really doesn't care about people's dying. And purely for political benefit, and that for political benefit, for not even political benefit, personal benefit, right? It's not even political. It's really just him very personally, whether he's winning or not. And he long ago painted himself into this corner of having to not wear a mask and not take it seriously. And so, and now he, of course, he can never back down from that. And we're all paying the price of that. I mean, it's great to hear of the vaccines, right?
Yeah, I'm excited about that, but it's going to be 6-month minimum from the time they start distributing them to when everybody who needs it can get it.
Yeah, so, and during that time, a long way off.
During that time, we could have we're at 260,000 right now, and we could double by March. We could be at 520,000 by March, and even with vaccines starting to be rolled out, it's still a potential that another 100 or 200,000 people could die after that. So we really could approach 1 million casualties by the time this is over. And what it comes down to also that we can't forget is, and it's more of a socioeconomic thing than it is a race thing, but but they're tied together because it's the way it is in our country.
Sure.
Black and brown people are like 3 times more likely to die of this. And it's not because of any particular risk factor in their bodies. It has to do with the fact that they're more likely to be in service jobs where they're in contact with more people. So this is a situation where a lot of white, reasonably well-off people are sitting at home and having people bring them things. That's
literally what's happening.
That's what's happening. And we're, I guess I'm in that category.
Me too.
Because I want to live, it's like,
I'm
taking precautions. But what I also realize is that my life and my existence is now dependent on people who aren't so lucky. They have to, they're out there driving around, being in contact with lots of people every day. I mean, think of the people who work in the grocery store so we can eat, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think about this all the time. I mean, it's just amazing. It's just so American, frankly, how slanted and how inequitable the burden for this pandemic is who's carrying that burden, right? On the very top end of people who have private jets, and they're still just living their life, they're just living their life and they just go about their business. And I can tell you, I won't name the source, but I know people who are in very, very high places who are just living their life as if
nothing was going on.
Nothing is going on. And they live. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people in a small 2-bedroom apartment in New York with a bunch of kids, and they have to now school those kids because those kids are they have to supervise those kids at home, and somehow find a way to work. And again, and meanwhile, I sit here in my middle class home and have things brought to me. And I mean, like you say, Sean, I think that what we can do, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing what you and I shouldn't be doing what we're doing. Our listeners shouldn't be doing what they're doing. They absolutely should protect your family, protect yourself, but do so with knowledge, right? And do so with recognition of what's actually happening here and how this is actually working, right? And who is the what? And I'm going. This is like full communist now, but like. The blood of the blood of people and maybe the phlegm of people who are dying of COVID-19 is greasing the wheels of capitalism right now. That's what's fucking happening.
No question. And the reason why I think it's absolutely ethical and acceptable to gloat over Donald Trump or Donald Trump Jr. getting COVID or any of these, frankly, ghouls who are running the country is because they, being of the privileged group, had an extra responsibility. When Donald Trump took the oath of office as president of the United States, he swore to defend and protect Americans from all threats, foreign and domestic, right? I mean, that's what you swear to do. And so essentially, he has violated his oath of office, and he's done it in such a way, we know that his agenda from Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon on down is a white supremacist agenda. He's proving it. These policies, this policy of inaction, just like kind of let it take its course, right?
Yep.
That is disproportionately killing Black and brown people. It's a form of genocide.
I absolutely agree. And look, I mean, we could keep talking about that all day because fuck those people, honestly, dude. I mean,
Fuck them.
Fuck them. And the lack of empathy, and there's no excuse for it. There's no excuse for it. And people, and even the people who aren't dying, the people who have lost their jobs, who have food insecurity, right? The food banks are running out of fucking food. This is the world we're living in right now. And it's unconscionable in a country like ours. Unconscionable. Criminal, you know? Yeah. And with that, let's go over to, and speaking of criminals, let's talk about the fucking Nigerian, these fucking crooked, I mean, laughably crooked generals. So here we are. So we're going to go to our friends in Nigeria. Shout out to our friends out in Nigeria. If you're listening, we love you. Thank you so much. Tell your friends, and we're thinking of you. The Nigerian army admitted on Saturday that soldiers were given both live and blank bullets when they were deployed to protests at the Lekki, I'm probably butchering that, Lekki toll gate on October 20th. And the Brigadier General Ahmed Taiwo says in his testimony to the Lagos Judicial Panel of Inquiry into the incident, he said that, he just sort of casually says, I'm paraphrasing now, soldiers were given both live and blank bullets. We saw some hoodlums, quote unquote, just unnamed hoodlums that were around. And so there were definitely peaceful protesters for sure, but there were also, quote, hoodlums. Comment on that, Sean.
Oh, geez. I'm laughing because this is just so fucking absurd. And I mean, okay, we've heard this before. Back when the Soviet Union used to be the Soviet Union and they constantly put out this horrible propaganda, this is exactly what they said. They said there were hooligans. Whenever they went into a crowd violently and suppressed a demonstration or arrested people, it was because there were hooligans. And lo and behold, what happens in the United States when there's a protest? There's always thugs or violent protesters. And it just, it's transparent, because when you're not accountable and you're not a democratic regime, you have to pretend that everyone opposing you is a violent hooligan. Right?
Yeah.
And so these guys got caught massacring civilians. And so this is their little fallback position.
Yeah. And look, like you correctly said, we see this, and this is what's, I think, terrifying about all of this, is we're seeing this all over the world, but this used to be, and I always talk about the 90s, right? That always seemed to be some other country out there. Some country where, where everything has been going to shit for a long time. But look, first of all, Nigeria, as we've talked about, is a country that is the most populous country, a relatively wealthy country, right? And this is happening there. This is some straight up dictator shit. And now we also see this on American streets, right? Where this idea of like, Antifa and thugs and all this kind of stuff. Basically, this idea of like a dark horde out there, right? That is evil, and it's unnamed, it's amorphous, it's faceless, but it's evil. And thank God we have the hard-nosed iron fist of dictatorship to protect us, right? That is the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's disgusting, and we know that this is the strategy. And the crazy part about it is that you would think that as much as these tactics have been used throughout history, that people would see through them, but they still buy it. Like if you're watching Fox News or whatever, they're still pushing this stuff, that the protests were illegitimate because people got violent. And it's like,
exactly.
And there's no way for any, like, for example, if you're Black Lives Matter and you want to hold a demonstration and you're expecting tens of thousands of people to come out in the streets, there is absolutely no way. You could be as careful as you want. You could even employ 100 security guards, and it's not going to be enough to stop violence if it kicks off organically. And this is what dictators know, and they take advantage of it. And even if it doesn't, they'll send in provocateurs.
Literally pay people to go.
And there may have been some of that going on in Nigeria, by the way.
Exactly. And an important thing to note here is that the police and the army that is previously had denied this, and then CNN apparently did some digging, and some investigative journalists. It's important, right? The importance of a free press, right? And they went and did some digging, and they're like, no, there were spent casings here that were not dummies. And then now, of course, the government's fallback position is, oh well, yes, we did give them some bullets. Yeah. So just acknowledging, we were lying before, but now, don't worry, now we're telling the truth though. We're telling the truth. It just goes the authoritarian tendencies that we see in Nigeria, in the United States, in Armenia, all over the world, in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, right? The same kind of tactics of throwing innocent people under the bus and to maintain some sense of order. Or I mean, China, right? Jesus Christ, China. I mean, wow.
Belarus, the Philippines, Brazil. So much of the world now is just, it's not even remarkable anymore when people are shot down in the street. That's right.
And again, one of the chilling things for those of us who are Americans is that we used to live in a world where it could never happen here, and we're supposed to be some sort of beacon, some sort of the oldest democracy, an example, right? And now we are completely shitting the bed in our responsibility. And frankly, I'm embarrassed as an American.
It's horrible. It's mortifying.
It's mortifying. I mean, this is not the America, I'm proud. I'm a patriot. I'm proud to be an American. But this behavior, and despite all of America's flaws, I am proud to be an American. But this kind of behavior is we're not modeling the democracy we're supposed to be modeling to the rest of the world.
Yeah. And it would be one thing if this was as bad as it's going to get. But when this kind of stuff starts happening, it is a fast train to hell. And
it's hard to put that back in the bottle.
Yeah. And you start to see, okay, we know about what happened in Nigeria because of CNN and because of whatever local investigative reporting is going on. But you see that dictators, the first thing they want to do is shut down the free press. So however bad it is now, imagine all this stuff going on and us not finding out about it.
Yes, exactly. So fucking important.
Dead men tell no tales.
Yes, exactly. And brutal, man, brutal. Now, I just want to briefly talk about, just mention that we were on the Blinded by the Light podcast, and we had an amazing time. They are friends of ours. Justice and Baird are great people, a lot of fun. We had a nice time. We talked about our experience getting out of Church Universal and Triumphant, and out of, more importantly, I think, even broader, the sort of that kind of thinking, right? Rather than even just the organization, because that can last a lot longer. Sean, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I want to say that we're going to be bringing this podcast to you. First of all, it's going to be posted on their website, I believe, and their YouTube and everything else next week. And we will bring it to you the following Monday after Thanksgiving as a bonus episode, because we're not going to be producing another episode next week.
Right.
So it was a really great. I enjoyed being on it. I think our listeners will enjoy it. It is a bit different than our normal political topics. We talked a lot about our own pasts and about things that would really be of value to you if you are someone or know someone who has been in a cult.
Definitely. And definitely not how we, our style. But I think we had a really nice time talking. And again, it was much more personal, much more intimate. Not that we're not personal intimate here, Sean. I mean, come on. I mean, we're personal intimate, but just a different vibe. But an excellent podcast. Please do check that out. And again, we are also going to be carrying that same podcast, but go ahead and subscribe to their podcast and listen to them if you like the show. And I definitely think you will. All right. So let's get into our main sort of topic for the day: biology and race. And this is a contentious topic, right? And I want to frame this discussion first, because I think this is something that might make people feel uncomfortable, but I think it's important. And and I'm quoting now: people who identify as Black or Hispanic in the United States and elsewhere, on average, obtain lower IQ scores than people who identify as white or Asian. So, Sean, that is like I think an uncomfortable topic for liberals to think about. I think it's sort of in our DNA to think of ourselves as all essentially equal, and certainly not to talk about biology. Why do you think, right, that people are so afraid to talk about this, especially liberals?
Well, okay, so it's not just race; it's also gender, and what the main thing that's going on here is, I don't think people have come to terms with the fact that you can have legal equality at the same time as you have unequal talents and unequal aptitude and unequal. I mean, it's just like we have no problem with the fact that you can line up a group of people and you're going to find clustering toward the middle is going to be the average, right? If whether it's weight or height, whatever trait it is, attractiveness, all of those things are on a bell curve. And so it's not I don't think liberals have a problem with a bell curve. I think they have a problem with putting personality traits and intelligence on the bell curve. Nobody worries about bodies. They worry about when you start talking about mental abilities. And so it comes down to this. It's also a conflict between essentialism, when I say, well, this is how a person is, and versus social constructivism, which is where when you have something, whether it's masculinity or blackness or whatever cultural identity someone has, if you think of yourself as a Christian, you think of yourself as an atheist, whatever your socially constructed identity is, in a lot of people's minds, the social construction dominates. Especially liberals think that, and whereas I think conservatives might be more inclined toward essentialism, but it's not that simple. It doesn't just break down between liberals and conservatives. There's like a horseshoe thing that happens with this whole idea of relativism and postmodernism, and you'll see on Fox News and on OANN and on Newsmax and Breitbart, you'll see this complete just abandonment of facts. And it's not a coincidence that the liberal postmodernists, extreme left, will also question the validity or even the existence of facts. Right? There are no facts, only interpretations. That's a Nietzsche quote, I believe. And I'm not a scholar of postmodernism, by the way. And I'm sure that if there are any watching this right now, I'm going to mangle something. But my point here is just looking at the results. Okay, I mean, I judge by the results, and it seems to me that this making of common cause of the postmodern left with the sort of fact-free right, and this is actually a thing with conspirituality, right? This is this whole horseshoe thing exists, and it's doing damage. So, we've got postmodernists making common cause with fascists, and I want to talk about a little bit about what Simon Blackburn has called the recoil argument, and that is, there's a statement by the postmodern left, academic postmodern left, that facts are completely culturally dependent, and they a lot of times attack the sciences in this way. And Simon Blackburn says, well, if you're going to make a statement that there are no facts, that is itself an absolute statement. So relativism becomes self-refuting, right? Because why should I believe the relativists and the postmodernists that there are no facts? I mean, that's an absolute statement in and of itself. They're claiming that's a fact. So it's a bit of a self-refuting philosophy. And it also, one more point about this.
Yeah, go for it, man.
That Hannah Arendt, I mean, I quote this constantly, probably quoted it 5 times in this show, but in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she said, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. Okay? And that's why I think the left can't deal with this subject. I think that there is some sort of a fear on the part of the left that it's going to lead to I don't know, if you admit that people have different IQs, that it's going to lead to eugenics.
Yeah.
And other things. But it's really, they're basing, instead of looking at the science and just saying, okay, this exists, let's see what's true. They are looking at the result of what they think the consequence is going to be of even acknowledging that there are differences in the mind, just like there are differences in the body, and they're distributed on a bell curve. And I know we're going to talk about this later. I don't want to jump the gun, but that's what the book that was written by Charles Murray is actually called, The Bell Curve.
Right.
So I think that this is a reality. Traits, genetic traits, are arranged on a bell curve, and that includes things like intelligence and sociability and agreeability and a whole bunch of other psychological traits. So that's kind of my initial take. You want me to talk about this James Damore incident, because that's something where that's an kind of
go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
All right. Well, this happened a few years ago, and it was at Google. James Damore Wikipedia talks about this as Google's ideological echo chamber. And so this guy wrote an internal memo that effectively said that women were biologically less suited to technology work. And he was eventually fired, leading to a labor complaint, lawsuits, and eventual arbitration. It also set off a massive internet firestorm that became part of the larger culture war. And all the conservatives were lining up behind this interpretation of the science to say that women were less capable, because, of course, it feeds into their hierarchy fever dreams. But, so I think this is a matter of record. People can go look it up, and we'll put it in the show notes. But I think that is an example of the kind of thing that can be touched off by this, and why liberals fear discussing it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And especially right. And we're going to talk about this later on, how this has sort of resurfaced, right? This used to be, and we talked about this earlier in the show too, this used to be no longer a debate. People that talked about this, like the guy, Charles Murray, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, right? These people were at the fringes, and now they're being given platforms, right? I think also, and I wonder what you think about this, Sean. I've been thinking about this. I was thinking about this when I was putting together the outline. Is that I think that humans in general, including liberals, less so liberals, I think, but also liberals have, and I've encountered this online. Interestingly, I posted a quote from our last show, or an idea from our last show, as I do usually during the week. And, and it sort of touched off a little bit of a debate on Facebook. And it wasn't even really a debate. It was a discussion. It was good natured. And in fact, I think we might have gotten a new listener out of it, but it's always remarkable to me. And the quote was about, and I don't know exactly what it was, but the quote was about radical secularism, right? And because our last show is about defining radical secularism and what does that mean and what it does and doesn't mean. But it's amazing how uncomfortable that concept is to a lot of people, right? I mean, normally, if I post something, I'm going to get X, Y, and Z amount of engagement, right? But if I post something about secularism, like the engagement's a lot less. It's not like people don't see it, but they don't want to engage it. It's something it's a taboo, right? And I think that taboo comes from this idea, right? Like that. I wonder if this taboo is connected to this idea of not wanting to admit that the human being is just an animal, right? I think that is another one of these ideas that is super uncomfortable for people. And so I think that we may be bumping up against that kind of a taboo as well, right? Because that undermines the idea of the soul, undermines the idea, frankly, even of free will, right? When we think about like, oh my God, I'm just behaving just like my cat behaves. Like she just has a series of behaviors, right? And she responds to stimuli. Am I just a series of behaviors responding to stimuli? The answer to that question is yes, by the way, I think. But I think that makes people very uncomfortable.
Well, okay, so it goes back to the way that the planet developed. other than China's in kind of a separate world because they've been developing for 4,000 years. But in terms of in terms of the West, Europe developed first. We had the ports, we had the resources, we had the technology, we had all of those things, and so the world grew up around kind of whiteness. Although, from what I'm understanding, Europe was fairly a lot more diverse than we realize. But
interesting.
Yeah, there were definitely people moving around from other places coming to Europe, but Europe was centered around whiteness and the aristocracy and all of those things, and everyone darker was thought to be more animalistic, less intelligent, more prone to crime, less trustworthy, all of those things, because when you're on the top of the heap and you're centered around whiteness, okay, as Europe was and as the United States has been. This is kind of how it gets expressed. And so we saw in the law, in the 3/5 compromise, in all of the white supremacist law that has existed in the United States, that these were considered lesser beings. And that, if another way of saying that, is more animalistic.
Yep.
Less able to feel pain, less emotionally deep, less intelligent, all of that. So this is the essence of white supremacy, and it exists in America on tons of levels, both overt and covert. It's reflected in employment statistics, housing statistics, who's granted credit, mortgages, business loans. Even there was a segment on, I think it was 2020, and they went in and they appraised a house, and it was a black woman married to a white man. And this appraisal came out ridiculously low. And so what happened is the woman took all of her pictures and everything out and moved out of the house for a couple of days. And they called another appraiser. And the appraisal came in $100,000 higher.
Holy fuck, dude.
$100,000. And this is like a $300,000 or $400,000 house. So this is like a 30% increase in the appraisal value, which determines what kind of a mortgage they can get, whether they can afford to move, all of these things like that. So this is all a matter of record. Okay. Anybody who wants to try to say racism doesn't exist has to contend with that stuff. So, and so we just have to understand that this is all a false premise. It's totally bunk. When you filter out socioeconomic and other non-biological factors like culture and upbringing and education, there are virtually no differences in aptitude or character that depend solely on skin color. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, you know what, let's briefly go back to that history, right? So I want to just sort of go and look at the reasons why things like scientific racism came to being. We talked a little bit about that already, but so, ironically, it grew out of sort of Enlightenment egalitarianism, right? And that sounds sort of kind of contradictory, but I've been reading a little bit about this and I find it absolutely fascinating. So in his book, Racism, a Short Story, Stanford University historian George M. Fredrickson notes, and I quote, "If society is premised on an assumption of inequality, producing an unquestioned hierarchy, then there is no need to locate the cause of the underling's position in some specific characteristic on their part that makes them less worthy than others. However, as societies have become increasingly committed to the belief in freedom and equality, as once revolutionary ideas about equal rights for all have become more widespread, especially in the West, then those groups that are systematically denied the entitlements are claimed to possess what Fredrickson calls some extraordinary deficiency that makes them less than fully human. That is, racism arose as a result of the contradiction between egalitarian principles coupled with the exclusionary treatment of specific ethnic groups." And at the beginning of around the 18th century, as Enlightenment rationalism replaced faith and superstition as a source of authority, the pronouncements of science became the preferred sort of method of reconciling the difference between principle and practice. So basically what he's saying here, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating, is that as we talk about on the show all the time, that historically, most of human history, we have lived with with gross inequality, with a small number of people hoarding resources and just dominating based on power, and people lower in the hierarchy just sort of accepting that this is their lot in life, that they are a woodworker and not a king or whatever. And so you didn't have to come up with reasons why people deserved to be worse off than you, right? It was just accepted by everybody. But as we got into the Enlightenment and people started thinking, oh, well, everyone deserves equal rights, and we're going to rely on science, and we're going to rely on all these things, then suddenly you had to find a specific reason why people who had way less and had no power and had no rights and didn't enjoy the fruits of democracy, right? You had to then justify that by saying, oh, they're actually literally scientifically inferior.
Well, this is fascinating, and I think a lot of it has to do with, how wide is this gap between the rich and the poor, right? And it has been much wider. I mean, one thing that the modern capitalism has done is that it has narrowed somewhat the gap between within the middle class and poor, but then you still have these people who are way up here. Right. And so, but getting back to this, if you're living in a mostly labor/merchant culture, right, there's not that much of a difference between the guy who owns the company and the laborer. I mean, there's a little difference, but it's not like the king versus the laborer, right? So if you had the carpenter or the plumber or the butcher doesn't feel like they are less than human.
Right.
They're getting paid something. They have some respect. They're valued as an employee. There's some, security that goes along with that. But when you're talking about people who aren't paid at all and who are just being used to do things like pick cotton, or they become, sexual slaves, or they are just degraded in 100 ways by being separated from their families, or being sold off, or being whipped, or all the different horrible things that happened. Now you've got to come up with a justification why that's okay. And
exactly.
If you remember in Django Unchained, how much they were into this phrenology bullshit.
Yes.
And that was a pseudoscience, but it served its purpose, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly the whole thing, right? When you are, and I just found that to be absolutely fascinating. It's counterintuitive, but racism grows out of some people deciding that they're going to, that we should be equal, right? So it's like, right. And it's remarkable, but that is sort of how it goes. And I think you explained it really well when everybody, and this is interesting because this is something that capitalists, modern capitalists don't seem to understand, right? Like, you can keep people happy if you just give them enough what they need and some semblance of respect, right? People just want to be able to sort of raise their kids, right? And have some level of job security and retire. And if you give people that, like, they'll just be perfectly happy to let you be rich, and let you be 10 times, 20 times, 100 times richer than them, And that's why I thought it was really interesting when you brought up the difference between, let's say, the baker and the shoemaker, right? Like,
who cares?
Who cares, right? We're all basically making the same amount of money, more or less. And maybe you have a little bit more, but that's okay, as long as we all have some semblance of dignity and respect. And it's something that powerful people can, like, over the ages, have continued to misunderstand, right? And the same thing with Southern planters. I've been reading, as I would say, pretty much every week. I've been reading Du Bois because I'll be reading it probably for the next year. So I'm going to, so I'll keep sharing my insights as they come up over the course of the next year. But it really, he talks a lot about the sort of the psychology of he's not a psychologist, but he talked about the psychology of the planter class of the South, right? And they couldn't conceptualize the idea that Black people could want more than what they have, that because they were so committed to what we're talking about right now, right? That Black people were not fully human. Since they were so committed to that idea and it was so fundamental, they couldn't even conceptualize the idea that Black people wanting anything different, and that came at the end of to bite them in the ass in the end, right? It really did, because they weren't actually they weren't sort of basing their decisions and their life on reality. And powerful people don't understand how much people want dignity and how people they need it, not want, need it, and will do anything for it, right? So here we are.
Well, this is really interesting, and I want to go back a little bit to sort of talk about how this has led to Trumpism, because in our country, we need to do a whole hour on inequality, but this is this is like the 3-minute version. The 3-minute version is that when the tax rates got lowered, it created a situation where now all of a sudden people who could potentially make millions of dollars a year could actually keep that money, because prior to 1980, tax rates were about 70%. The top tax rates on individuals, and corporate taxes were in the range of 39 something. They were higher than they are today by probably double.
Oh yeah, easily. Yeah.
And even before that, going back into the 60s, I believe, there was a top tax rate of 91%.
It's wild.
And what that did is it sort of acted as a salary cap, because and it was on income over about what would be today $3 million a year. So if you're working for a company and you're a CEO and you want them to pay you $10 million a year, there's really no reason to do it under that old system, because the bulk of it, if you were making $3 million, you're fine. You get to keep most of that money, maybe, whatever the tax rate is. But anything above that, most of it's going to the government. So it doesn't make sense for your company to pay you that much. And so what that does is it reduces the amount of massive compensation packages that are floating around. And so it keeps the CEO closer to the skilled professional. So maybe there's a 30 times multiple of the lowest paid worker that the CEO is getting. Whereas now it's routinely 200, 300, 500 times where the executive is making, and when you add stock options, it could be thousands of times.
Yeah, thousands of times, yeah.
So what you have is a situation where that money could all be going to be distributed among the rank and file. And there was a time in the US when you could, with a high school education, support a family. And that doesn't exist anymore. We don't, and some of that's globalism, but these things worked together to decimate the working class and to take away their dignity, essentially. And so now you've got a situation where the white working class is finding themselves perilously close to the plight that Black people have been dealing with all along.
Right. So true.
So this is the impetus for Trumpism, because ostensibly it was about trade and about not wanting to compete with people in China or India who are working at lower wages. And yes, that did put pressure on wages, on global wages, Mexico even, right? So you had all this business about the border wall and about tariffs and all that was an attempt to protect the position of the working class in the United States. But their real enemy is not China, not India, not Mexico. It's the 1%, the 0.1%, who are making tens and hundreds of millions of dollars a year and not giving any of that back either to the government, which could help the middle class through social services, or to the workers themselves. It's just take. And that is how we got Trumpism, because these people are saying, understandably, we're fucking fed up. We don't like the fact that we are losing our dignity. And by the way, your Democrats want to give Black people and Mexicans preferences. And what about us? So that's how we got where we are. And what ended up happening instead is everybody's getting screwed now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was really well said. And I'll add on to that, again, going back to Du Bois, is, he talks about how the greatest problem for the freedman, the freed Black person, but also the poor white, is that the poor white doesn't identify with the freed Black. He identifies with the planter. right? He thinks that one day he'll be a capitalist, that he'll be a planter, right? And the last thing he wants is a handout from the government that might make him be like one of those blacks, right? And so that's a huge factor at play here. And of course the megaphone that blasts this message is organizations like Fox News, or at least their opinion section. And of course, right-wing radio has been doing this for 30 years. And now, of course, the internet, and most nefariously, Facebook, which just basically just allows this sort of, because they make millions and billions, literally billions of dollars off of this industry. They profit off of fake news and this whole narrative. And so, and it all comes together in this disgusting, toxic brew that gives us Trumpism, just like you say, man.
Yeah, and as we talked about in our libertarianism segment, it's also a matter of political power, because these billionaires have been able to concentrate so much money that they have just bought the political system. And so, and when the middle class Trumper hears that Joe Biden wants to raise taxes, or Barack Obama wants to raise taxes, or whatever, they actually they hear that they're going to raise taxes on them, on the working class. That's what they hear. And no matter how many times Joe Biden says, no, I'm only going to raise taxes on people making over $400,000 a year, they still hear, I'm going to raise your taxes.
That's what they hear.
It's insane, because these guys could be getting health benefits and all kinds of other things that would make their lives much easier. And that's what we want for them.
Yes, that's the irony of it, right? Like, and also, right, they could be getting, right, and perhaps even more useful, because they'd be open to it, I think, in a different way, is having union help, right? Or having collective bargaining rights, right? So that you are not just pushed around by your employer, that you have some sort of leverage, right? So you can demand a fair wage, you can demand a pension, or a system for retirement. You can take care of your children, even as a laborer, right? You don't have to be one of those elite, whatever. You can be a metal worker, a skilled laborer, right? And make a really good living. And by the way, you should be able to do that and be a waiter for your entire career, and be able to find affordable health care, right? And be able to be ensured that you can live some life of dignity. No one say everyone should be equal, or everyone should be rich. It's just a life of dignity, where you don't have to, you don't have to go to a food bank, and you don't have to, and you don't have to, you can just live a life of decency and raise your kids and die a happy old man. Like, that's or woman. That is all anybody ever wants.
And again, just like the tax lie, what they also hear is that, well, you want to have burger flippers driving Mercedes. I mean, fuck you.
God, just again, straw men. We talked about earlier, the worst kind of arguments are straw men fallacy arguments and fucking bad slippery slope arguments. There are good sometimes slippery slope really is a slippery slope, but usually it's not. And so, and let's introduce Charles, the audience here, to Charles Murray, because this is sort of like, we're really going to get into the nitty gritty here. So Charles Murray is really the face of modern biological racism that we've just discussed. And it's telling that he is on the Southern Poverty Law Center website, because you don't end up there if you're a decent guy. Right. That's not. And they've described him this way. Charles Murray, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, has become one of the most influential social sciences in America, using racist pseudoscience and misleading statistics to argue that social inequality is caused by the genetic inferiority of Black and Latino communities, women, and the poor. According to Murray, disadvantaged groups are disadvantaged because, on average, they cannot compete with white men who are intellectually, psychologically, and morally superior. Murray advocates the total elimination of the welfare state, affirmative action, and the Department of Education, arguing that public policy cannot overcome the innate deficiencies that cause unequal social and educational outcomes. And look, the Southern Poverty Law Center has a position and a slant, and I get that. But we are going to talk about, as we move forward, exactly how Murray really is peddling racist pseudoscience. Like, right? Like,
Well,
you know what I mean? He really, really is. That's not a joke. Sean, what do you have to say?
That was fucking horrible. I mean, first of all, when I hear American Enterprise Institute, I mean, this is the premier libertarian think tank. And we have, for our listeners, you guys all know that, you know, this is all about hierarchy. And if you're a conservative, you want hierarchy. And he is just chapter and verse right down the line. And he's using it to also create a fake racial hierarchy that really doesn't exist. So, I mean, God, you know, like there was that whole podcast that Sam Harris did with Charles Murray, and I didn't listen to it. I just couldn't. I'm sorry. What I did listen to,
I didn't listen to it either. Full disclosure, I didn't listen to it. I've been studying it because for this podcast, but I couldn't do 2.5 hours of Sam Harris sucking his dick. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't fucking do it. And look, we love to hate Sam Harris on this podcast. Sam Harris has been a huge influence in my life. And some of his early books, we've talked about this. I'm not going to beat the dead horse here. He's had some amazing early books. You should probably read them. But he has gone off the fucking rails. Yeah.
And he is really on board with this hypothesis as much as he wants to say, because, you know, they tell you if you're a filmmaker or if you have a podcast or whatever it is, when you put someone on your podcast who's saying something, you're saying it.
Yes.
It's not like you cannot hide behind, oh, that was my guest and we have all points of view here. I mean, it's nonsense. Okay. If you have somebody,
that's like Trump saying, if I retweet something, you know, man, you retweet the white supremacy. He's like, oh, but no. I'm just retweeting. Yeah. That's not coming from me. It reminds me of that, you know?
Exactly. And you're amplifying it. And he knew damn well that Charles Murray had a reputation for racism. And he actually had him on the podcast because of that reputation, because he was mad that Charles Murray had gotten deplatformed. And so he's like, I'm going to give you a platform. It's like, dude, you give a racist a platform, a Nazi a platform, that makes you a fucking racist and a fucking Nazi.
Yeah, man. I mean, go ahead. Keep going.
Oh, well, so I did listen to Sam Harris interview with Robert Plomin, which was great because and both of these I had read about the interviews, and so I Robert Plomin is better than Charles Murray by quite a bit. He's more of an honest race scientist, right. And so he really actually it was great because right off the bat in the first 20 minutes of the episode he debunks this idea of group IQ differences, which is what the whole Charles Murray thing is.
Right.
And so this is a quote from Robert Plomin. He says, "The most important point to realize is that there's no necessary connection between the causes of average differences between groups and individual differences. Individual differences in a trait like intelligence could be very highly heritable. That doesn't necessarily imply that an average difference between ethnic groups is also heritable." So, poof.
The entire argument falls the fuck apart.
Totally. So he says, there's 3 reasons why I've stayed away from group differences. Number 1, there's much more variance within groups than between groups. Male-female difference accounts for 1% of the variance between, say, verbal or math skills. That means if you know whether a child is a boy or girl, you still don't know anything about their verbal or math ability. That's very important because that basically just tosses the whole James Damore memo out the fucking window.
where it fucking belongs.
Yeah. And number 2, we don't have any killer methodologies to answer the question of genetic and environmental causes of average difference between groups. In contrast, we have very powerful methods of understanding differences within groups. Number 3, you don't have to study everything. Toward the end of your interview with Charles Murray, now he's talking to Sam Harris.
Right.
Toward the end of your interview with Charles Murray, you asked him why he persisted so much in studying the average difference between groups. I thought his answer was very unsatisfactory. There's lots of important things we could study, like why are some people schizophrenic and others not? And most of the variance that we're trying to explain with genetics is within groups. So why focus on the politically explosive issue of average differences between groups when we don't have powerful techniques to definitively answer the question of the etiology of those differences? And that's why I think there's so much heat and so little light there.
Oh, I love that. What a debunking. I fucking love it.
Just killed it. Just killed it.
Killed it.
And so Sam Harris kind of goes, yeah. Well, I think we have to be careful and blah, blah. And he goes off into this little, like he realizes that his whole thing with Charles Murray has just been completely debunked. Yep. And so he goes off whining for like 5 minutes about how he hasn't recovered from even having had this conversation with Charles Murray. And it's like,
oh, God.
No shit, Sam.
Yeah. Because and this is after he already got his ass handed to him by Ezra Klein, and there's a whole everyone should go. We'll put the article in the show notes, but in that article there's a bunch of amazing links out to the sort of discussion that Ezra Klein and Sam Harris engaged in via email, and it ends at the same place that you are describing Sam Harris now, with him whining about about grievance. Because at the end of the day, Sam Harris is a warrior against convention, right? And so that is really what is, and when he's focusing that at religion, that's great, right? When he's focusing that on rationality, that's great. But when he's tried to make the shift in general, and also, by the way, he has some valid critiques about the postmodernist left, right? Valid critiques. Like you and I agree with some of those critiques, right?
Well, we talked about it earlier in the show, and some of the things I was saying, again, probably not as coherent as Sam Harris's critiques because he studies this stuff. I didn't, but we know the outlines of the argument, and we know that what is really going on with the right wing in most cases is that effectively their argument is oftentimes if someone has tried to suppress something, that makes it true.
Right. That's so great. But it's so true. It's so true, right? It must be true, or it must be relevant. And by the way, it must be part of the conversation, right? Like that is what they believe, right? That is what they believe. And I think Sam Harris, frankly, between you and me and everyone who's listening to this podcast, and hopefully Sam Harris, I think, Sam, that you have, I'm now talking right to you, Sam. Sam, listen, sit down. You're a good guy. You're smart, and we respect your old work. But what's happened is you have tried to remain relevant by focusing your ire against taboo onto the left, because that is you've already done it to the right. You've already done it to religion. So now you're turning it to another area. But the problem is, Sam, that in trying to stay relevant, you are inviting hacks and giving them a platform. And you are embarrassing yourself. That's the thing, right? You're embarrassing yourself because people like me and Sean, Sam, we used to respect you, but you're losing us. You're losing us. And that's unforgivable.
It is. You're inviting racists and Nazis and, these essentially, Charles Murray, there may be some good social science in his book, but what's wrong with him is the conclusions that he wants to slash and burn social safety nets.
Exactly. And so I'm going to walk through the premises of his argument, because someone wrote this out. This is not me. He didn't come up with this. I thought it was really, really interesting. But here are the premises of Murray's argument and why, and we'll get into why they're flawed generally. Intelligence as measured by IQ. This is a true statement, right? Intelligence, relatively true. Intelligence as measured by IQ tests is a meaningful construct that describes differences in cognitive ability among humans. True. Individual differences in intelligence are heritable. To some extent, yes, definitely true. Racial groups differ in their mean scores on IQ tests. Also true. Of course, those are socially constructed groups, but nevertheless, we should thus, and here is where things start to get crazy. We should thus assume that the reasons for racial differences in IQ scores are themselves inherently genetic. That's a problem. And therefore, and this is the real problem we have with it, and therefore, Murray concludes, social programs designed to shrink the achievement gap between white people and people of color are a waste of time and resources. So as far as Murray is concerned, inequality of outcomes is inevitable and in some sense desirable.
Right. Well, because he's okay with the hierarchy. He's not an equalist,
That's right. He's not.
And of course, he's an academic who's white, who's on top of the heap. So why would he be? right?
Exactly.
And he works for the American Enterprise Institute. He literally gets paid to promote inequality.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I mean, we hammer on this all the time. And I know we probably sound like a broken record, but we have to remember this is actually interesting. This is relevant to the discussion we started way in the beginning of the show about how we deal with Republicans going forward, and how like the kind of leadership we need that's capable of dealing with Republicans on their own terms in the knife fight in the fucking phone booth, right? So we have to stop thinking that the GOP has the same goals that we have. Right. Mm-hmm. We as liberals tend to think like, well, yes, of course, naturally, everybody wants everyone in society to prosper. Right. Of course, we're Americans. Right. We all want to do better. And frankly, we're citizens of the planet. We all want. But that is a premise that does not apply to conservatism. Right. It literally doesn't. Like we always remember that, like, there's always a better fish. There's like it's like a little internet. Yeah. Like always a bigger fish. And like you should look that up. Google or YouTube, there's always a bigger fish, because that guy breaks it down so well. The bottom line and the gist of the whole thing is that they don't want to be equal. It's all about the hierarchy. It's all about being able to dominate those below you and be supplicant to those above you.
Yeah, well, when this is the famous conservative slogan of all time: "A rising tide lifts all boats." It's like, well, some of them are yachts, and some of them are people clinging to driftwood. Okay,
exactly.
Big difference.
Big difference. So, in an episode that runs nearly 2.5 hours, Harris, who is best known as the author of End of Faith, presents Murray as a victim of a politically correct moral panic. And this gets to Harris's whole fucking thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he is obsessed with this idea. And he goes as far as to say that Murray has no intellectually honest academic critics. I mean, wow. Murray's work on the bell curve, Harris insists, merely summarizes the consensus of experts on the subject of intelligence. The consensus, he says, is that IQ exists, that it is extraordinarily important to life outcomes of all sorts, that this is largely heritable, and that we don't have any interventions that can improve the part that is not heritable.
Wow. So we can't do anything. We just leave people to their own devices, right? It's like, oh, how convenient. We can cut all the budgets and keep the money.
Exactly. Right. Oh, this is definitely not a disingenuous conclusion that we've already reached, and we are now trying to manufacture retroactively a logical stepping stones to it. It couldn't possibly be that. I mean, it's astonishing, right? This guy's got an agenda. The quote scholars that people that he quotes are literal neo-Nazis, right? They're literal neo-Nazis. Like, I'm not even making that up, right? Like, these are people who are white nationalists, maybe not neo-Nazis, but white nationalists, explicitly so. And these are people he quotes as, quote, scholars. Unreal.
Well, it's very similar, actually. Applying the bell curve, the well-known, well-understood concept of the bell curve of different traits to social science is no different than phrenology. It's modern. It's the modern equivalent of phrenology, of justifying why these people are subhuman and why we don't need to help them.
Yep. It goes right back to what we were talking about at the top of this section, right? That there needs to be a justification for inequality in a culture that claims to value equality, right? We in the West, that's what we claim to value, right? But conservatism, certainly modern conservatism, but I think conservatism fundamentally, right? We talk about the Conservative Mind, one of my favorite books, right? And he does such a great job of describing conservatism as just reactionary. It is by definition reactionary, and it is reactionary to progress. And so as society gets increasingly more equal, that is literally the last thing the conservative wants.
Well, right. And I think this idea that Charles Murray is talking about, that IQ differences fully explain differences in life outcomes, it might be the most dangerous idea of the past century, because it deflects from any need for structural reforms to get rid of what we've discussed before as engineered poverty, because that's exactly what is going on here. And so if you can make it their fault This brings in the whole just world fallacy.
Yes.
And it's just a giant rationalization for victim blaming. It goes by the euphemism meritocracy.
Oh, what a joke.
It's one of conservatism's favorite terms because it favors the already powerful. Like we said, if you make a lot of money, if you are, a scholar like Charles Murray who works for the American Enterprise Institute, or if you're Peter Thiel or anybody, Jeff Bezos, you want to believe that you earned that.
Yep.
And so you couldn't invent a more perfect meme to oppose equality, to oppose the reform of capitalism than this just world fallacy. And from a utilitarian perspective, however, it's got a real problem because the cure for cancer or the solution for climate change could be languishing in the brain of someone who's doing the modern equivalent of picking cotton.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you believe that we shouldn't help the poor, then you are essentially saying they have no value. They can't help society. And
they're worthless.
And liberals also kind of get this wrong because liberals sort of they want to help the poor out of a sense of obligation or maybe just guilt in general, or because they don't want to have to step over homeless people on the street when they're walking to work. But this is the wrong way to think about it. We should be supporting equality out of enlightened self-interest. We should make sure that everyone gets an education because we need cancer cured. We need the climate fixed. We need the next greatest breakthroughs in electric aircraft and space travel and nuclear fusion and artificial intelligence. And the world has just a metric fuck ton of problems to solve, and we need to put all our human resources on the task. And as the United Negro College Fund commercials used to say when I was a kid, I remember this, a mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Yeah.
They were on point about this decades ago. They understood exactly what we're dealing with right now. And this is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, and then I'm finished with this part. But this is important. He says, I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops.
Boom. Boom. Like that's so on point. And it's funny. What I'm reminded of is how the kings and emperors and the imperial dynasties, they are always like fraught with diseases and genetic disorders, mainly because they're all marrying each other, but also because even just within that community, there's only so many ultra wealthy people. Right. And so if you're only marrying each other, you're going to end up with genetic problems without infusing new sort of genes into the gene pool to sort of help to bring in new healthy, new, different, diverse sort of a gene pool of genes to the gene pool. You end up stagnating, right? And that is what, again, I talked earlier in the show about how, and this is an idea that I've thought about a lot, is how powerful people they always go blind to how they go blind to a lot, but they go blind to how they'll be better off. Right. If they allow that diversity, if they do allow people that are not them to have power, we will all be better off. But it requires someone to be willing to unclench their fists. And to be honest, John, we're human beings. We are born, we tend to want to retain what we have and our power, right? And fight tenaciously. And so one thing, and I'll finish out in this, is like you talked about earlier about the importance of incentives, right? And creating a structure. And we talk about this a lot on the show to sort of to shepherd human behavior along, because given unaccountable power, human beings will do what white people have done as the kings of of civilization, and they will do what white planters have done, and they will do what kings of old did, which is basically hoard power and suppress dissent.
Well, this is what happened. The perfect example is Donald Trump. I mean, the entire world
of course.
has seen this. I'm sure when he was a kid, maybe he was all right. Maybe he could have been okay if he'd grown up with different parents and not been given everything. But the fact is, and this is a proven fact, power causes brain damage. Because if you're scrappy and young and intelligent, you have to deal with all kinds of problems and solve those problems in order to get to the next level. But if you're somebody who is like Donald Trump, who has a safety net and is constantly just given more money and more money and more money, you fail up.
Yes.
So he has failed up at every level. And so after he was done failing up multiple times and being at the head of the Trump organization, his only place to go was into the government. And now he's failed at every level of governing. So he's still trying to fail up. His latest coup attempt is an attempt to fail into dictatorship.
Yep. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right, man, and that's a great example. And what was particularly appalling, right? And I mentioned Ezra Klein earlier, but because Ezra Klein really dismantles him, this Harris and Murray and everything, but they don't even describe Harris and Murray. Don't talk about, Ezra brings this up. They don't talk about the legacy of slavery, racism, Jim Crow at all. And the entire conversation, like, it is astonishing to talk about differences in outcomes, to have a whole 2.5-hour conversation about that and not bring up the legacy of slavery once. That is an astonishing lack of intellectual honesty. And these two people think of themselves as academics or as public intellectuals or whatever the hell they think of themselves as. Like, how can you with a straight face talk about the outcome for African Americans in the United States without talking about slavery and racism?
You can't. And I've found this same when I've talked to, because I've had some deep conversations with some people who believe what Charles Murray has to say. And when I start to talk about how, this might have something to do with slavery, and there might be like 100 years, 400 years of history that has resulted in a continuing disadvantage building up over many generations of not being able to get the education, of not having support, of being in poverty and all of these things. And they don't want to hear it. They literally shut down when I talk about any of those things. They just say, I can't even remember that they even had a coherent argument. It was just more kind of repeating the fact, or they'll bring up something disingenuous like, oh, well, look at this place that abolished slavery and look at it now. Look at how horrible it is. Like, some place in Africa, or I think, is it Haiti? I don't know. There's just places that used to have slavery that don't have it anymore, and now they're shithole countries. And so it's like, it would have been better had we continued colonialism and kept order, right? This is the mentality. Every solution goes toward hierarchy. Let's reestablish the hierarchy.
Yes. That's a great way to bring it back to the hierarchy, man, because that's exactly what this is. And, we talked about earlier today, you and I, about that when you are impoverished, right? And of course, Black people have been disproportionately impoverished for hundreds of years. And you are basically living in full-time fight or flight mode, right? You are living with elevated hormones and there's just a lot going through your body, your experience, right? You talked about earlier that like poverty lops off 10 points off your IQ score across the fucking board, right? So it's like, again, and also I like to point out that the Black achievement gap, it's shrinking, right? The IQ gap is shrinking. So is it, right? So Charles Murray and Harris, is it heritable, 100% heritable, or is it not, right? Because if that gap is closing, it obviously isn't inherent. So, wow. I mean, and again, we're not denying here, and we're going to talk about the end of the show, we're going to talk about the importance of recognizing, especially on the left, the real, that Science is real, right? Genetic science is real. Genetic differences among groups is real. Divergence is real. But nevertheless, to jump to the conclusion that people that are of a certain color or gender or ethnicity are inherently worse at living, which is literally what he's claiming, at living, at outcomes, right? That is an astonishing claim, and it is, and again, it overlooks the reality of centuries and centuries and centuries of racism, and by the way, a patriarchy. By the way,
well, you mentioned this royal inbreeding, and I wanted to kind of take the opposite of that, because what's if you have people who are closely related, cousins, whatever, marrying, you get all this inbreeding, which produces inferior genetics. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is breeding people who are very different. So if you bring in people from all over the world, you get a diversity that just doesn't exist otherwise. And so, you add to that the variability of what happens in each genetic combination of a different sperm with a different egg. You're literally talking about hundreds of millions of possible combinations in each conception. So you're going to have differences within families, and so there's so much more to be considered when you start talking about how traits pass from generation to generation and what creates a good outcome. And they have boxed themselves into this idea that groups are inferior, but have they studied what happens generation to generation when you bring together people from Africa, people from Europe, people from Asia, and you put them all together and you have a melting pot? Have they studied that? I don't think so.
I'm sure they haven't, Sean, because right, as I said earlier, they've already reached their conclusion that they want to reach, right? Mm-hmm. The conclusion is that rich people should be able to keep all their money and poor people deserve it's just world fallacy, right? That is their conclusion. That's the conclusion they've already reached. They are now just trying to find, it's like talking to people who are saying, no, God is real. And they've already established that, like, no, I already believe that. Now I'm just trying to find a logical set of steps for me to justify my pre-existing belief. It is the inversion of science, right?
It is. Well, and it's a mantra. Multicultural societies don't work. Multicultural societies don't have social cohesion. Multicultural societies have higher crime. Multicultural societies fall apart and go into degeneration. I mean, they repeat these things like mantras, and they're not looking at the opposite case. And they're not looking at the fact that Europe itself was extremely diverse.
Right.
At the time there was tremendous amount of migration. And so America's was kind of the exception. And yet we have had immigration the entire time.
Right. Exactly. Oh man. It's so true.
We had these, we had a combination in the beginning. It was like, it was English, German, Irish, and it was a very, very narrow group that came over here initially. But then all of a sudden you had all this immigration in the 20th, 19th and 20th century. And we really did become that melting pot. And now we're trying to somehow turn the clock back to, Anglo-Saxon, whatever. Yeah.
Right. It's wild. It is absolutely wild. And my revised hierarchy of premises, as we close off and I want to get your thoughts on this, Sean, but before we close off the Charles Murray segment is, so premise one, intelligence as measured by IQ tests is a meaningful construct that describes differences in cognitive ability among human beings. True. Mm-hmm. That's what we said earlier. Number two, individual differences in intelligence are heritable. Yes, we agree. 3, racial groups differ in their mean scores on IQ tests. True. Now, here's where things got weird before, and they're going to get weird again. The evidence does not support the conclusion that genetic differences are the sole or even the primary driver of IQ disparities across racial groups. And number 5, even if it were true, and it's not, that IQ disparities among racial groups or ethnic groups or class groups were entirely genetically determined, even if that were true, and therefore inevitable, society should still ensure that every person can live a life of dignity.
Yeah, well, just expanding a little bit on what we said about poverty shaving 10 points off a person's IQ.
Yes.
That's just poverty. What about danger? What about if you're in a neighborhood where you're hearing gunshots all the time? How can you do your homework? if your parents are fighting, or if you have malnutrition, all of these things, there's just
physical abuse,
right? So there's all these things that will lead to this self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think that's right. What you said in number 4, the evidence does not support the conclusion that genetic differences are the sole or even the primary driver of IQ disparities. We have to look at sociology. And one of the things that's in sociology is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is the amount of inequality in a society, and it is correlated with all kinds of negative outcomes, including IQ. So we could talk about that in our hour episode about inequality, but these things are not separate; they're tied together.
Exactly.
And so again, as I mentioned, we shouldn't just help the disadvantaged because we feel sorry for them or we think it's the right thing to do. That's the wrong way to look at it. This is win-win. You help the disadvantaged, you get better people. You have a better society. You have more people interested in science, more people interested in making the world a better place. And you also free them up to become active citizens and participate in the democratic process, which is another thing that the wealthy don't want.
The last thing they want. Like the last thing they want.
People who are working 3 jobs, you're lucky they even vote.
Exactly. And a lot of times they don't.
Yeah, and I'm saying this is not just an abstract principle here. The history has proven this is correct. I mean, if you like using the GPS on your phone or in your car's nav system, the math that makes that GPS work was invented in the 1950s by a black woman named Gladys West.
Yep.
And you know that for a black woman in the 50s to get in a position to get an education and become a mathematician and prominent enough to invent something that complicated, I mean, the hurdles she must have had to jump over.
I can't even imagine. Just astonishing hurdles, man. She must have been an unbelievably special woman. Like, I mean, remarkable human being, you know?
Well, and what we saw in the film Hidden Figures was also, I mean, black women helped get us to the moon, and especially getting the astronauts back safely, right? That whole scene that happened there was legendary. And again, that's just one story out of how many thousands and thousands of amazing, dedicated black men and women throughout our history who have invented things that have made our lives better. So when we fail to put resources and make them available to all of our citizens, we are shortchanging ourselves of the next set of those kinds of developments.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, look, I mean, this is why corporations now are like, and I believe that not all of them, but some of them really care about diverse points of view, because they've realized, right, that honestly, you get better results if you have if you have more people at the table, right, with different perspectives, different ideas. If you just you're going to X out 50% of the workforce, women, because and just don't take them seriously because because you want to be in power. I mean, you are just right. I mean, you are just ignoring a talent pool that is just sitting there waiting to be tapped, right? I mean, this is and again, and for women and people of color and poor folks, this has been the story of America, frankly. It's been the story of Western civilization, frankly, right? That and it's sickening that these conclusions, the fact that we don't have a lot of, say, women astronauts. I'm just pulling that out of the hat. We don't have a lot of it, so therefore women are unable to achieve what men are as astronauts. That the premise is there. That you have to conclude the sort of premises you have to accept to get to that conclusion are just so obviously fraught for all the reasons why that we've talked about today in this segment. And again, like you say, it's a win-win. Everybody wins when everybody has enough and can prosper, because then we really get to harness the full intellectual and thrift and power and passion of the entire community, not just a handful of powerful, wealthy, connected, whatever people.
Yeah, and what's happened is over the course of the movement of the Republican Party, further and further and further and further to the right, okay, we have a situation where it's interesting that you brought up the corporations are now to the left of the Republican Party.
They literally are.
And it started out where the corporations were buying influence and lobbying and doing all of those things. And now it's only a small fraction of corporations like the Kochs and Adelson and some of these the Mercers.
Yep.
It's only a fraction of these people who are right-wing ideologues to the point where they don't get this. The bulk of corporate America, whether it's, I don't care if it's Amazon, I don't care if it's Procter and Gamble, I don't care if it's Ford or GM or whatever. These guys are on board. They know the value of a diverse workforce, and they market to a diverse consumer. And so this is Trumpism is just, I mean, everybody's against it.
Everyone.
Yeah.
The only reason why we're even having this conversation is because Republicans are afraid to alienate their base. Because Trumpism, there's only like 20% or 30% of people that are that hardcore into it, but they have a disproportionate power impact, you know?
Well, because of the propaganda system.
Absolutely.
They just pump these messages in over and over and over again. And by the way, corporate advertising is pumping the opposite message. I mean, you look at every ad that's on in a big event, whether it's a Super Bowl or whatever, it's diverse. It's just done. It's fucking done.
It's over. It's over. They're holding on to the past, right? And it's fucking over. And the fact that, right, and the fact that we can even have to have these discussions is chilling, but it's also good to know that some of the bigger power brokers, even if they're far more conservative than you and I are, they are on board with some of the fucking basics. Like, for example, immigration is actually good for the economy, for example, right? That, and like we're talking about, diversity is good for our business. We should do this. This is good. This is good. Purely selfish, for purely selfish reasons, but they're arriving at the same conclusion, you know? So I want to just close out this discussion. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Sean?
Oh, it was just a brief interjection.
Go for it. I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
About Kaepernick and about Nike, and they had a
shift.
They could look at the market and they can see, all right, are we going to cater to these haters, or are we going to cater to the future? And it was no brainer for them.
No brainer. They know. They see the writing on the wall. And the same thing, by the way, with the car industry, the car industry. They're still everyone's trying to find an electric car, right? Everyone is working toward that. Like, right, regardless of what the Trump administration does, and maybe they're happy that they get a tax break, or that the emission standards are not to be as strict on X, Y, and Z truck, but ultimately, they see the writing on the wall, right? They know where the country is going. And if you're going to run a business responsibly, you have to predict these things, right? You know, simple as that.
It's truly scary, though, that the corporations, the biggest corporations, are not even as far right as the people running the country. That
is terrifying. I laugh because it's so insane. I mean, I now look at George W. Bush and Mitt Romney as moderates.
Total moderates.
That is where we are. That is where we are, dude. That is where we are. That is how far the Republican Party has shifted to the right. They have literal neo-Nazis walking in their parades. That is where they are. That's where the modern GOP is.
And saying that we should respect the results of an election is now controversial in the Republican Party.
Astonishing. And terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying for all the reasons that you and I always talk about and worry about on the show and and behind the scenes, right? This is why we do this show. This is what we're trying to combat. These are the ideas we're trying to stop the spread of these ideas and instead spread better ones. And and speaking of which, circling back to the beginning of our conversation, it's talking about good ideas and spreading good ideas and combating bad ones. The truth of the matter is that there really are genetic differences across races. It can be upsetting to liberals, but it's true. But I want to read, before we close off, New York Times op-ed, and get your response too, Sean, but for a geneticist. His name is David Reich. So he is a geneticist, and I really loved his op-ed in the New York Times because I really thought that he respected and discussed why and validated why liberals are worried, right, and don't want to have these discussions. But he also had the courage to say that we need to stake out this ground, because if we don't stake out this ground of the realities of genetic differences, science is going to leave us behind. And what's going to end up happening is that we're going to leave the field unoccupied and open for racists like Charles Murray and others to occupy the field. So let me just quickly read this to get a sense of what modern genetic research had into average biological differences looks like. Consider an example from my own work. Beginning around 2003, not my own work, Christophe Defoe, by the way, I'm not a geneticist. Beginning around 2003, I began exploring whether the population mixture that has occurred in the last few hundred years in the Americas could be leveraged to find risk factors for prostate cancer. And that is, it's a disease that occurs 1.7 times more often in self-identified African Americans than in self-identified European Americans. This disparity hasn't been possible to explain based on dietary and environmental differences, suggesting genetic factors might be at play. And I won't read for word every other word of this quote because it's long, but the gist of it is that did a lot of research to African Americans, tracked the genetic differences and the parts of their genome back to West Africa, and within that area, I'll read this now. In 2006, he found exactly what he was looking for, a location in the genome with about 2.8% more African ancestry than average. So Black African Americans who are susceptible to getting prostate cancer, more susceptible than most, he was able to track that place in the genome to people who have African ancestry that's more than average. So the conclusion is that, yeah, look, West Africans are more, and it's a simple one, are more prone to prostate cancer. And that is a genetic difference between that and Europeans, that and African Americans. And that's a significant thing. And that's good because now we can screen these folks earlier and save lives. So this is sort of I wanted to bring this up just because this just demonstrates the value of this sort of thing.
Absolutely. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the very beginning, which is that, and this is the same thing with evolutionary psychology, right? Liberals have no trouble accepting the evolution of our bodies and genetic influences on our bodies. But where they start to get really upset is when we start talking about genetic influences on the mind. And so these questions of intelligence and emotional intelligence and like I said, different traits like, honesty, conscientiousness. There's a whole list of these traits that if you study it genetically are on a bell curve like every other trait.
Yes.
And so it doesn't, I think what people are worried about is that this reduces a human being to a number kind of a thing. And that it's complex. And so if you bring up intelligence, they'll go, oh, well, intelligence isn't everything. Emotional intelligence is important. And personability is important, right? And so it's just a way of trying to kind of stop people from being ranked in a hierarchy because liberals are really allergic to that.
Yeah.
And also they're allergic to the idea of determinism. They like to think that we can all choose and we can be educated. Racism can be the idea that racism is taught, which is that wrong idea. The blank slate is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely.
Genetics it liberals see it as a straitjacket when actually it's just information.
Yeah, right. Because liberals tend to think that if we reach certain conclusions about differences, genetic differences, et cetera, that necessarily means that we need to treat people poorly. Right. That we need to, or people deserve fewer rights. And they have a good reason to worry about that because on the right, they really do want you want to use it for that purpose. Right. But again, we cannot, and that's why we cannot cede this field to the right, because if we do, these ideas, these Charles Murray ideas will continue to percolate to the surface if we don't go in there and say, no, here is the truth about how genetics impacts how we are as human beings, right? And that it is really determinative, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that people deserve fewer rights. It doesn't mean that.
Well, part of this is liberals' terrible tendency to accept right-wing framing of issues because of liberals' constant desire to compromise, constant desire to meet halfway, and which is you can't do that when you're dealing with terrorists. I mean, these are literal terrorists. The idea of Charles Murray that somehow there is scientific basis for reducing aid to the poor, that's terrorism. I mean, that's genocide.
Genocide.
You're going to kill people by doing this.
Nope.
So,
and it reminds me, right, of what we talked about at the top of the show as well. This idea of like, the GOP and Republicans, and led by Trump, and they are guilty of murder. They're guilty of murder because their obsession with power has made them unable to take human lives seriously, and they're out of touch. And here we are, a raging pandemic, a constitutional crisis, and meanwhile, and assholes like Sam Harris are giving racist platforms. This is America that we're living in. This is the 90s pastel era. This is not.
No, and there's it's across the board, because sure, COVID is killing people, but also lack of nutrition for poor kids is killing people. Lack of education is going to result in lower lifetime earnings, which is going to result in more stress and possibly divorce and alcoholism, and is ultimately going to kill people. And so you have this, the right-wing ideology is a death cult. Yep.
The death cult. And we could jump into the death cult conversation. We should at some point, because man, every religion really is a death cult, right? I mean, but let's not even get into that conversation. Like, we could be here for another hour. Look, all right. Once again, everybody, thanks so much for being here. And I want to remind you to make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit that red subscribe button. And please give us a 5-star rating on your podcast host, and write us a review over at Apple, because that will really help us grow in their recommendations list faster than anything else. Tell your family about the show. Word of mouth really matters. Thank you so much for being here. We love you. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.